Introduction to the struggle. The apartment was cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and refuses to let go. Mark sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, the dim light from the single lamp casting long shadows across the room. His fingers fumbled with the crumpled dollar bill in his hand, the last of his savings. It was all he had left. The weight of it was heavier than it appeared, like an anchor dragging him deeper into the void he'd been sinking into for months. Once, Mark had been different. He used to be someone others looked up to, ambitious, confident, always talking about the next big idea or the next step in his career. But now, his future felt like a distant echo, barely audible through the noise of his mounting debt and crushing self-doubt. He had worked hard for years, chasing dreams that now seemed out of reach. Bills piled up like mountains, and every day felt like a struggle to survive. The apartment, a forgotten relic in a neighborhood that time had passed by, was a testament to the slow unraveling of his life. The furniture was sparse, each piece a reminder of better days, before he had lost his job, before the bills had become more than he could handle, before the relationships around him had started to wither away. His phone sat on the coffee table, dead silent, just like everything else in his world. Mark stared at the dollar in his hand, turning it over as if expecting it to magically transform into something more. But it didn't. There was no miracle, no last-minute save. Just this single dollar. $1. It felt absurd, even laughable. This was it. The last tangible thing that stood between him and absolute ruin. His stomach growled, a cruel reminder of how little he had eaten over the past few days. The fridge was empty, and his options were slim. He could use the dollar to buy a meal, something to quiet the gnawing emptiness inside him. It would be temporary, though, a fleeting relief. Or he could take a risk. He had heard about a small business opportunity that could potentially change his life. It wasn't much, but it was something. A long shot, maybe. BZT sometimes, that's all you have left when you've been backed into a corner. The decision pressed on him. A part of him wanted to hold on to the dollar, keep it for himself, and eat just enough to make it through another day. But there was a voice inside him, buried beneath the layers of doubt, urging him to take a chance. He had nothing left to lose. In some strange way, that made the decision easier, and yet infinitely harder. Mark's gaze drifted to the window, where the night stretched out endlessly, much like his future. The world outside seemed unaware of his struggle, as if it was spinning on without him. He could almost hear the whispers of his past self. The man who had once believed in possibility, in the power of making things happen. But that man felt like someone else now. A soft sigh escaped his lips, and for a moment, the dollar seemed to lose its power over him. He wasn't just holding a bill. He was holding the last thread of a dream, fraying and fragile, but still there. And the question lingered. Would this last dollar be his salvation, or would it simply mark the end of everything? The decision had to be made. The decision. Mark's mind raced as he stared at the dollar in his palm. The world outside seemed distant, muted by the constant hum of his thoughts. His stomach ached, but it wasn't just hunger. It was a gnawing feeling of desperation, the kind that sinks deep and doesn't let go. His hand trembled slightly as he held the last piece of currency between his fingers. It was more than just money now. It represented the weight of every failed plan, every missed opportunity, and every decision that had led him to this moment. The choice felt impossible. He glanced at the phone on the table, still lifeless and silent. There were messages from friends, old acquaintances, even some distant family members, but none of them had answered his calls in days. It had been like this for months. Once, he had been the one everyone turned to for advice or help. Now, he was the one who needed it, and the silence only reminded him of how far he had fallen. You can't eat a dream, he thought bitterly, staring at the dollar. There had been a time when he might have laughed at the idea of using a dollar to take a chance, But now it seemed like his only option. He had heard about a small startup, just a few people working out of a tiny office, hoping to make a dent in the market. They had posted an opening for a position that Mark was perfect for. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a chance. If he could get in, he could rebuild. Slowly, surely. But there was a catch. The company required a small upfront investment to secure his spot, something he didn't have. The opportunity wasn't much, but it was something, and that made it worth considering. Mark's mind flicked back to the past, the time when he had decided to gamble everything on the idea of stability. He had given up his passion for a steady paycheck, played it safe for years, and watched his soul wither in the process. The paycheck was long gone now, and stability had proven to be an illusion. He had nothing left but this dollar. His stomach growled again, louder this time, as though it too was pleading for an answer. He could go to the corner store, buy a sandwich, and live another day. Another day of surviving. Another day of staving off the inevitable. But would that be enough? What happens after? He closed his eyes, trying to picture it. Another day, another dollar. Another series of mundane decisions that kept him treading water. Or was this it? Was he ready to risk everything on a hope that this tiny investment might be the breakthrough he desperately needed? The rational side of him screamed that it was foolish. But what if the dollar was the key to something more? Mark's heart raced. He could almost hear the voice of his former self. The man who once believed in taking chances, in seeing the opportunity even in the most unlikely places. That voice was fading, but it wasn't gone yet. He stood up, the decision pressing on him with a weight that felt heavier than the dollar itself. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and for a brief moment, everything was still. The future, the past, and the present all collided. He didn't know if this would be the right decision, but he knew one thing. He had to make it. And with that thought, Mark stuffed the dollar into his pocket and headed for the door. The choice had been made. The consequence. The walk to the small office felt like a lifetime. Mark's steps were heavy, each one sinking into the cracked sidewalk like a reminder of the weight he carried. His hand, stuffed deep in his coat pocket, clutched the dollar he had decided to risk. The cool air stung his face, but it couldn't mask the rising tension in his chest. What had he done? Was this madness, or the last spark of a man who still believed he could turn things around? As he approached the small building, a rundown structure that seemed as tired as he felt, Mark hesitated. The glass doors were scratched and worn, the fluorescent lights inside flickering as if the place itself wasn't quite sure it was still alive. He had done his research, knew the startup's name, had read their mission statement. They were small, yes, but they were hungry. And hunger, he thought, was something he could relate to. When he pushed open the door, the musty air greeted him, carrying the scent of stale coffee and desperation. A receptionist, young but weary, looked up from her desk. Mark's stomach churned again as she gave him a once-over. The doubt, the judgment. It was there, in her eyes. She asked for his name and the reason for his visit. Her voice flat, as if she had seen too many hopefuls come through this door only to leave empty-handed. "I'm here about the position," Mark said, his voice firmer than he felt. "I'd like to speak with someone about the opportunity." The receptionist barely glanced at him before picking up the phone. She dialed a number and spoke briefly into the receiver, then motioned for him to wait in a nearby chair. He sat down, feeling the familiar weight of rejection starting to settle in his bones, but he refused to let it show. This was his chance. This had to be his chance. Minutes later, a man in his 40s appeared, disheveled, as if he hadn't slept in days, but his eyes sharp and focused. He introduced himself as Ethan, the CEO. "Mark, right? I'm glad you could make it." Ethan's handshake was firm, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "Let's cut to the chase. We're looking for someone to take on a project, but you have to understand, it's not easy." We don't have much to offer, and if you're here for a quick payday, you're in the wrong place. Mark nodded, his throat dry. I'm not here for a quick payday. I want to build something. Ethan studied him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. That's what I like to hear. But the truth is, we're barely staying afloat. We don't have much of a budget, and if you want in, you'll need to put something up front, just a small investment to cover your part. Mark's chest tightened. His last dollar, the one thing that had kept him tethered to the idea of a future. How much? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. $50, Ethan replied casually, as if it were nothing. We're just looking to see who's serious. You in? Mark stared at him, the room spinning for a moment. The weight of the decision hit him all over again. He had come this far, but the gap between his dream and reality had never been more apparent. He had no choice but to turn around and walk out. Without that 50, he was nothing here. This wasn't a gamble. It was a dead end. For the first time in months, Mark felt the crushing weight of defeat.